Okay, thank you, Kevin. You laid out the task. It's perfect for us. Like I said, it's cold and rainy outside, so let's stay in here and have a great conversation. And so we are fortunate to have our keynote, Rich Caruana, who is joining us from Microsoft. Rich Caruana is a principal researcher at Microsoft. Before joining Microsoft, Rich was on the faculty in the computer science at Cornell, at UCLA's medical school, and CMU's Center for Learning and Discovery. He's a PhD from CMU, where he worked with Tom Mitchell and Herb Simon. His thesis on multitask learning helped create interest in a completely new subfield of machine learning called transfer learning. Rich has many accolades, including recognition by the NSF, and he's going to talk to us today about an interesting topic. Friends don't let friends deploy black box models. This sounds very intriguing. So please join me in welcoming Rich. Rich.
Good morning. Hey, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to talk to you today. Also want to thank them for making me feel right at home weather-wise. I'm from Seattle, so this is perfect. So I'm going to talk about the importance of intelligibility in machine learning, especially if we're using machine learning and AI in critical settings like healthcare. Before I jump in, I want to thank a number of other people who have collaborated with me on what I'm going to talk about. In particular, 3 grad students, Yinlu Saratan, Shuzhou Zhang, who have worked on this with me over the years. And then there's a number of other people, including people all the way back to CMU days, and people who work at hospitals who have collaborated with me. So I want to say thanks to everyone, because without them, this work wouldn't happen. OK, so let's jump right in. Let me try to be a little provocative here. A number of people in machine learning, I'm a machine learning researcher, a number of people in my community think that if you train a deep enough neural net on a large enough data set, and if the accuracy looks really good, possibly even superhuman accuracy, that you're just sort of good to go. You know, it's safe to go ahead and deploy that model. And the truth is there are settings where that's absolutely correct. But there are other settings, particularly healthcare, where this is a very risky attitude to adopt. And what I'm going to do is try to show you some examples of how machine learning can sort of make mistakes that would be risky in a healthcare setting that we would want to repair. So that's where we're going to go. Let me show you some things that deep learning do. I mean, the fundamental problem is going to be that machine learning, artificial intelligence, thinks quite differently than humans do. And because of that, it's going to make very different kinds of mistakes than we would make or than clinicians would make. And that's the sort of fundamental problem. So let me just give you some fun examples. So here's something that a deep model thinks is a panda with 55% confidence. And then this apparently is a nematode. The model's not very confident of that, though. But if we add a little bit of this nematode to this image, we get an image that, I don't know about you, but I can't tell there's any difference in that image, OK? And suddenly the model is incredibly confident, 99% confident that it's a gibbon. OK, so we've made what looks like no change whatsoever to the image. It still looks kind of panda-like to me. And all of a sudden, the model is very confident that it's a gibbon. And I'm going to guess none of the 7 billion people on the planet would have made that change, right? Would have agreed with that. OK, so this is just one example of how these machine learning models think quite differently than we think. Let me show you another example. So this is from the same work. Apparently, that's a cheetah. Apparently, that's a bird. This is another bird. There's a panda again. That's a centipede. OK, and the model's very confident that each of these is those classes. So again, this is an example of things that deep learning does that we probably, as humans, would not do. This is actually one of my favorite examples. I think this is actually really clever. These are like the platonic form for a guitar, or the platonic form for a remote control. I mean, does that really capture the essence of remote control? So you can tell there's something clever and interesting going on inside these deep nets. But it's not the same as maybe how you and I would think about these things. I mean, probably none of us, if we were just shown this image, would say, oh, that was a remote control. But when I say, oh, this is the model thinks with high confidence this is a remote control, then we sort of get it. And that does look a little bit like it's captured the flow of music. It might be guitar-like. Maybe this is peacock-like. It's kind of cool. These are like the platonic forms for these classes. But they're still very different from how you and I think. Although in this case, I think we can relate at least to the images, right? They seem kind of cool. So this is an example that machine learning, while still different than us, does in some cases get the essence of things in a way that humans might agree with. Okay. The fundamental problem is that, machine learning's from another planet than us. And we are on this planet, and we want to use this technology here on Earth to make healthcare decisions. And the fundamental problem is that it's just going to make different kinds of errors than we make. And because of that, our approach is going to be to try to understand the models so that we can figure out what they're doing and then sort of figure out what wonderful things they've learned and also what things they've learned that we need to change. So that's where we're going. OK, so how did I get into this? So back when I was a grad student at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, this is in the 90s, I was asked to train a neural net on a pneumonia risk problem. OK, so everyone in the room, you've all been diagnosed already with pneumonia. And our goal is to figure out if you're high risk or low risk. Okay? And if you're high risk, as you know, pneumonia is a very serious condition. 5–10% of patients with pneumonia die from pneumonia. So if you're high risk, you absolutely need to be in the hospital, maybe in the ICU. But if you're low risk, the best treatment would be as an outpatient. Okay? Chicken soup, antibiotics, call us in a few days if you're not feeling better. So we were training different learning methods to try to figure out if they could distinguish reasonably accurately between high-risk patients and low-risk patients so that we could do triage, pre-hospital decision-making, things like that. And I got lucky. The neural nets that I was working on in the 90s turned out to be the most accurate model that any of the many different groups working on this data set could train. And there was a question, would we now want to use this neural net, this very accurate model, would we want to consider using it on real patients? And I said, no. I think it's too risky to use this black box, which you don't really understand on humans. And I'll tell you why. And instead, we decided to use something which was not nearly as accurate as the neural net. We decided to use logistic regression, right, which is the method that's been used in healthcare for learning for 50, 75 plus years. So why did we do this? So a friend who was working at another university but on the same data set was doing rule-based learning, which was much more common in the 90s. And he learned this rule. He said, Rich, I learned this funny rule last night. The rule says that if you have a history of asthma, it lowers your chance of dying from pneumonia. That is, asthma looks like it's protective somehow for pneumonia. That's kind of weird. Irony, back then we were both computer science grad students, but Rich Ambrosino, who had learned this rule, he's now an MD at University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, so he can now answer this question. So we went to the next big project meeting where we had MDs involved in the project, and we asked them about this rule, and the MD said, wow, we consider asthma to be a serious risk factor for pneumonia, so you got to fix the models. They should not predict that asthmatics are lower risk. That's wrong. But we can understand why the model might have learned that, why this might be a real pattern in the data. And the story they told us is something like, well, asthmatics pay a lot of attention to how they're breathing. They know when something seems wrong. They have a treatment, an inhaler or something else that they use, and it doesn't seem to quite work, or they have to do it more often than they would expect. So something still seems wrong. They have a doctor who's already treating their asthma, so they're plugged into healthcare. So they call the doctor. The doctor says, oh, that's weird. You better come in. And then they get the diagnosis that, in fact, they have pneumonia. It's not asthma. And because they're considered high-risk patients, they get particularly high-quality care. So basically what's happening is asthmatics, because they're paying attention, notice the symptoms early. Because they're plugged into healthcare, they get to healthcare early. And then because they're considered high risk, they not only get the right diagnosis, but then they get very aggressive treatment. And all of those things for an infection actually do lower your chance of dying from the infection. All right? There's nothing more important than sort of rapid diagnosis and aggressive treatment for an infection. So in fact, the asthmatics do have less chance of dying from pneumonia than other patients who don't have asthma. It's not because they're intrinsically lower risk. The doctors tell us they're actually higher risk. It's just because they get to high quality care more quickly. And asthma is acting as a proxy for this. So, if the rule-based system learned this, I just assume, because it's a real pattern in the data, I just assume my neural net learned it. So somewhere in the millions of weights in the neural net is something that's equivalent to this. And if we were to then use that neural net's predictions, as accurate as they are, to decide what care you should receive, then maybe we would be hurting some asthmatics, because maybe we would be predicting that they were actually lower risk, and we would suggest that they not get to care as quickly or not receive as aggressive care when they get to care. So that could be dangerous. So now the key to discovering this problem was that something very intelligible was trained on the same data set, and it learned it and had a rule that we could understand. That was the important thing. I'm just assuming it's in the neural net. I don't actually know it's there. And you might think this asthma problem is why I decided, oh, we shouldn't use that neural net on people. Actually, it's not. I told them, you know, I'm a smart guy. I can probably figure out how to make this asthma problem go away in the neural net now that I know about it. And I can publish some more papers doing it, which is, for a grad student, that's great. The problem is, what else might be hiding in the neural net that's similarly risky, but the rule-based system wasn't sensitive enough to pick it up and to tell us about other problems that might be lurking in the neural net that we need to fix, these sort of unknown unknowns. And as I'm going to show you later, there were, in fact, other problems lurking in the data that we've only discovered more recently. So that's the fundamental problem, is that we really don't understand what's going on inside the neural net. We can't count on some other learning method to tell us about problems that might be in the neural net that we need to fix. So that's what made us uncomfortable with trying to use this neural net on real people. This problem is fundamental. It is happening. Many people in the room have done machine learning on data sets, on medical data sets. I guarantee you this kind of problem is in every data set you've used. The fundamental problem is confounding. So it's that asthma is acting as a proxy for features we don't have. The most important features we're missing are time to care and aggressiveness of treatment. Now, we probably could go back and measure from the records what the treatment that the patients received was, how aggressive their treatment was. Time to care, though, is really a challenge, because we don't know when you were first infected with pneumonia. We don't know how rapidly the illness progressed in you. We don't know when you first noticed symptoms. So time to care, just in principle, would be hard to measure. And it's probably the most important single variable there, which is time to care for an infection. So even in principle, we don't have a way of getting this. But you might think, well, in many data sets, you could have all the variables you want. Well, think about, this is all medical science, right? We keep improving, hopefully, every year, every decade. There are going to be new things we'll know in 50 years that might be relevant, that could confound the variables we currently have. That is, future things that we don't even know about are acting as confounders for the variables that we do have currently in the data set. The data set can't be complete in terms of features because science hasn't stopped yet. And even those new features that we won't know for 50 years can cause us to learn incorrect things on the features that are currently available to us. So I guarantee you, as you'll see more examples of these problems, I guarantee you these kinds of problems are happening in every data set we have. And the trick is to somehow be able to sort of find the problems so that we can then do something about it and safely use the models. You might think the goal is not to understand the models, but just to understand the data. It turns out data can be used for many different purposes. Modern observational data is complicated, could be used for thousands of different things. Somehow understanding the data would be kind of like understanding all those thousands of different things at the same time and being able to clean the data once for all those purposes. Well, as I'll show you, there is no one cleaning of the data that's appropriate for all those purposes. And this is a much too hard thing to do to understand the data. So instead, what we're going to do is we're just going to set a lower bar. We're going to try to understand a single model trained on the data, knowing what we're planning to do with the model. And then we're going to evaluate whether the model is appropriate for that purpose or not. So it turns out it's a much easier thing to do. And I won't talk about it today, but it turns out the techniques that we're going to talk about and the problems we're running into, this asthma bias, it's exactly the same story if you're interested in other things like gender bias, race bias, socioeconomic bias. It turns out it's all exactly the same story. So, although I won't talk any more about that today. Okay, all we would need to solve this problem would be something that was, say, as accurate as the neural net, so we had high accuracy, but was as intelligible as logistic regression. That would be fantastic, right? Because we can understand the model, and it would be a high flyer. Unfortunately, there tends to be this trade-off. So right now, things like deep learning, random forest, boosted trees, if you're familiar with any of these techniques, they tend to be very high accuracy, but they're not very good intelligibility. And then the things that tend to be intelligible, things like small decision trees, logistic regression, decision lists, small calculators. These things, unfortunately, on complex data sets tend not to be as accurate as we would like, but they're very intelligible, so we can see what they're doing. So what we're asking for is something in this upper right-hand corner. We're looking for something that's both very accurate and very intelligible. And to our surprise, we've had some success at putting a method up in that corner. It's not good for everything, but it's good for many things. It's particularly good for healthcare, in part because that's been my motivation. So that's what drives me. GA2Ms, it's a bad name for it. Generalized additive models with pairwise interactions is what that's a shorthand for. And many of you may know about generalized additive models, so we'll talk about that a little bit. OK, so let me show you model complexity space. So these are linear models. These are things everybody's comfortable with. Weight times a feature plus a weight times a feature plus a weight times a feature. Linear logistic regression are in that model class. And then at the other end of the spectrum is things that are just of arbitrary complexity. Think of these as deep neural nets, random forests, boosted trees. These are just an arbitrary function of all the available features. Now, fortunately, there's a space in between. This is the space of additive models. So this is a function of feature 1 plus a function of feature 2 plus a function of feature 3. The features can be of arbitrary complexity, but they can only be a function of one feature at a time, and it's a different function for each feature. That makes this model class significantly more powerful than, say, the linear. This is also of this form, but here the function is just a weight times the feature. This is a more complicated thing, potentially. That makes the model class significantly more powerful, but it turns out far less powerful than this. And interestingly, it remains intelligible. That's what's very important. Now, we can generalize that further. So this is the sum of all functions of individual features. That's this line. This is the sum of all functions of pairs of features. This is the sum of all functions of triples of features. If we let this get too complicated, then we're just back to here. And what we're going to do is restrict ourselves to functions of individual features, main effects, plus a small number of functions of important pairwise interactions. And that's because sometimes these interactions are important to the model. And the reason why we're going to stick with this model class is not because we believed when we started that it would be high accuracy. It's because we know how to explain this model, because it's an intelligible model. And then, as you'll see, we get surprisingly high accuracy out of it on many data sets. Now, we didn't invent these things. They were invented by statisticians, very smart people at Stanford in the 80s. So this is stuff that goes way, way back. And our contribution is going to be that we're going to just be much less conservative than statisticians were when they use these models. Statisticians fit these models with very smooth splines. They left out as many terms as possible. They wanted the model to be simple. And we're going to do the opposite. As machine learning people, we're not very risk averse. We're going to sort of throw everything in. We're going to let the model be as complicated as it needs to be if that'll provide accuracy. To our surprise, when we make the models more accurate, they also get more intelligible. And that's because they can better represent the detail that they see in the data. And that ends up actually making it easier to understand the model as opposed to harder to understand the model. I think it's something the statisticians might not have anticipated back in the 80s. OK, so I'm going to skip all the technical details of how this algorithm works. I mean, I think there are probably many ways to train models like this now that we have an existence proof. The particular algorithm we use is probably not that exciting. If you were all computer scientists, I'd be happy to go to the board and show you how it works. But instead, I think what's more valuable is let's jump in and see what we can learn with these models. Let's see what they can show us. Okay. So now I got permission after we had these models working to go back and reuse that pneumonia data set from the mid-90s. The data set, by the way, it's data that was collected in 1989. It's got about 15,000 patients, 46 features. And at the time, this was an amazing data set from a machine learning point of view in healthcare. So now it would be considered, I think, a modest-sized data set. But at the time, this was a great, fantastic data set. See, these are some of the features. We've got age, gender, whether you have diabetes, whether you have asthma, whether you have cancer. So these are just history and physical kind of things. We've got things from the physical exam. So doctors have seen all these patients and taken some notes. There's been a chest X-ray. That's how pneumonia was diagnosed back in 1989. So a chest X-ray was run for all the patients, and that's where the principal diagnosis comes from. And then there's blood test findings. So these are the kinds of things that we have in the data set. So these are the 46 features. Now remember, the model is a function of a feature plus a function of a feature. So there's going to be a function for every one of these features in the data set. And then we're going to allow 10 pairwise interactions into the model, so there'll be 10 more graphs as well, 10 more functions of pairwise interactions. So we've got 46 functions plus 10 more, so there'll be 56 functions total in the model. So let me give you an idea what that looks like. Don't worry if you can't read this. We'll zoom in a second. So this is a function of age. That's a function of whether you have asthma or not. It's a function of your blood glucose, a function of your blood pH, a function of your blood urea nitrogen. And the way you use this is, so you take a patient, you find their age, you read the Y value off of the graph, and you write it down. You find whether they have asthma or don't have asthma. If they have asthma, notice the graph goes down. If they have asthma, you write down a number. Down means lower risk, so the model is learning that asthma lowers risk, which is how this problem started in the first place. So you do this for all 56 graphs. You write down 56 numbers. The more negative the numbers, the more they lower risk. The more positive the numbers, the more they increase risk. It's like log odds if you're familiar with logistic regression. And then what you do is you just add all the numbers together, and the more positive the numbers, the higher the probability of death, and the more negative the numbers, the lower the probability of death. So there's this really is just logistic regression on top of transformed raw features, is the way to think about it. So there's a very easy procedure. I mean, first of all, what's nice is you just look at the numbers coming off each graph, and right away you know whether it increases or decreases risk, because they're just addition. They're all independent. And then there's an easy way to calculate a probability from the sum of all these numbers. So that's great. It's very, very simple. That's the only math we're actually going to see in the talk. Okay. So let's zoom in now. Let's look at what the model has learned. Let's look at age. Okay. So this is the risk function that the model has learned from age. Now, it's learning all of these graphs at the same time. That's critical. This is not, if you're into statistics, this is not marginalization or something like that. We're learning all of these graphs at the same time. That's critical. It means that if some kind of risk is picked up on one graph, it will not then be represented on the other graph. And it turns out that makes the graphs cleaner and easier to understand and prevents overcounting of evidence. Okay? So the bottom here is just the density. So this is a histogram of our patients. So most patients are between, say, 60 and 90. We've got some patients in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and a small number of patients out at 100. Remember, this is a data set from 1989. So this is what the models learned about risk. Remember, up is high risk, down is low risk. So let's just sort of parse this graph. Well, it's good to be young, and young means sort of anything under 50. Okay, the model could have distinguished, if it needed to, between people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, but it doesn't. It just sort of models them all as equally low risk. Okay, so that's a decision the model has made from the data. It's not something we've imposed on it. So basically, youth seems to end at around 50. So. Then, fortunately, it's not too bad as you go a little bit out of youth. You know, risk goes up slowly as you go through your 50s and into your 60s. And then there's a pretty rapid rise in risk at around 67, 68. We'll talk about that. It's pretty much retirement effects. Then risk goes up rapidly as you go through your 70s into your 80s. There's a surprising step function jump in risk at exactly 85. That's interesting. Surprising flatness in risk in the upper 80s and 90s that you wouldn't have anticipated. And then an even more surprising drop in risk at around 100, 101. So let's talk about these things. This almost certainly is retirement. So back in the United States in 1989, people would have retired roughly on schedule, and that would have happened at around these ages. If we do this on more modern data, we see retirement sadly shift to the right. So we see the same rise, but it happens later. It also is a broader peak because some people can still retire, you know, at the normal time, and some people now retire later. It's kind of sad to see that retirement is apparently not good for you. So at least if you have pneumonia, retirement seems to increase your risk. A lot of things happen in the US at retirement time. So your health insurance provider might change. Your insurance might change. Your daily activity might change. Your rush to get to care might change. You may have moved. You may not even have a new healthcare provider where you've moved to, so it might be an extra delay in your getting healthcare. And all of those things are not good for you, apparently, if you've now got pneumonia. Okay, so apparently retirement's not the best thing in the world. this rise at 85 is fascinating. So there's nothing in healthcare policy or in insurance policy that says we should treat 86-year-olds differently than 84-year-olds. So our best explanation from this, after talking to experts, is something like, you know, people who are over 85, especially back in 1989, like 95 is the new 85, right? You know, people are living longer now. But back then, over 85 was considered very old, the old side of old. And 85 is a round number, right? And we all use round numbers when we do reasoning. We're pretty sure this just represents the sort of, you know, Grandpa's 86. Grandpa's got a number of comorbidities. Grandpa now has, because of those comorbidities, has pneumonia. We've done 2 rounds of antibiotics. Grandpa's still very sick. Grandpa's not getting better. Perhaps we should let Grandpa pass. So we think that's what this represents. And we just think it represents a difference in the sort of aggressiveness of treatment for patients who are over 85 and patients who are under 85. And some of you might remember that pneumonia used to be called the old man's friend. We don't use that term anymore, but it used to be called the old, you know, the idea is that you're elderly, you have a number of illnesses, the end is in sight, let's say, and then at some point, because of these other illnesses, you get pneumonia, and 3 to 5 days later, you've passed away. So I guess that was like a friendly way to end. And by the way, some of the data sets, some of the medical data sets in this period, they didn't even bother to record your age if you were over 85. They just checked the 85 and over box, right? We would never do that now. But back in this day, you know, that's how we thought about people who were over 85. Now, fortunately, in this data set, we have everyone's age, so we can see the effect in the data set. So that's our best explanation. Whenever we see jumps at round numbers, your biology presumably doesn't know you went around the sun just one more time and click, you know, your risk goes up. So whenever we see these jumps at round numbers, almost always they're due to some sort of social effect, policy effect, some decision making. We don't know who's making the decision. It could be doctors, could be patients, could be spouses, could be children, right? We just know that the collective decision that's being made above this round number looks different than the collective decision being made just below it. And that decision is somehow increasing the risk for the patients. So now this flatness is kind of interesting. There's a chance that that's a sign of what's known as successful agers, people who have good genes. And if they've sort of made it to 90, it turns out being 95 isn't really any higher risk from a pneumonia point of view than being 90. So this might be this sort of flatness of the curve as opposed to this rapid rise that happens here in the 70s. It could be that that's because of successful aging, but we don't know that for a fact. It was just something suggested by another doctor. This drop at 101 or so is really fascinating. Again, when you see jumps that happen at round numbers, you suspect social effects. And we think it's just like this rise at 85, but it's the flip side, as in centenarians are pretty rare back in 1989. We think it's the sort of, you've made it this far, we're not going to give up on you now. We're going to go for the record. Like, you know, pneumonia is a treatable illness, okay? we'll go for that 3rd or 4th round of antibiotics. We'll pull out the super drugs. Let's go for it, and let's get you that extra year if we can. So we think this is a sort of willingness to keep fighting for the patient, because the patient has crossed this magic threshold of 100. And we still see this in other data sets. So even in modern data sets, 100 is still a magic number in people's heads. If we did ages in binary, maybe it wouldn't happen at 100. It would happen at some other age. But OK, so let's think about this. So now this is just one of 56 graphs that are in the model. And we've been looking at this graph, and I've been telling you some stories about what I think the graph means. This is a very accurate summary of how the model makes predictions. In fact, the model is 56 graphs. You could print this model on a tablet of paper, 56 pages, and if you can read the patients off of the graph to 2 decimal places on paper, you can make a prediction to 2 decimal places. The graph really is the model. Okay, this is not a simplified view of some other more complex animal. This really is what the model is training, is these graphs. Another interesting fact, these 56 graphs are actually more accurate than the neural net that we were able to train in the mid-90s. In fact, this is the most accurate model we know how to train right now on this data. So there's no loss in accuracy in getting this sort of intelligible model on this particular data set at least. So what's interesting is I assume the neural net, which is actually almost as accurate as this model, I assume the neural net has learned something very similar about risk as a function of age inside of its millions of weights. I just don't know where it is. I don't know how to see what it learned. This model, we can actually see what the model has learned and try to understand it. And it's up to us to do the detective work. The model is not telling us that this is retirement, that that's a social effect may be a genetic effect. The model's not telling us any of that. That is us looking at the model and then trying to do some causal analysis of what the model has learned. So that's us being the detectives and trying to understand the model. Okay, so here's a question for you. A lot of you have medical expertise. How many of you think that we should predict that a patient who's 105 is lower risk than a patient who's 95? Like, how many of you think that's intrinsically true biologically? That is somehow going from 95 to 105 actually lowers your risk. Okay, if we remove the social effects. Right, I see people shaking their head no, right? So that doesn't sound right. So would we want to leave that in the model? Would we want the model to actually predict that people who are over 101 are lower risk? I don't think so. The cool thing about this model, because it's graphs, we can edit the model. If you redraw the graph, the model will do your bidding. Okay, so if an expert looks at the model and decides that some pieces of the model I love that. I'm now a binary age. If somebody thinks that there are mistakes in this model, you can edit the model and you can update the model to reflect human expertise. Okay? And remember, the reason why the model was making this drop is because of the care the patients currently receive. The problem is that if we're going to use the model to intervene in patients' care, then they might not receive the care that made them lower risk. So the model could actually put elderly people over 100 at higher risk. And we don't want that to happen. So we would want to edit the model. Now, what about this thing at 85? Actually, I'm happy to leave that in the model because our explanation is that these patients aren't getting as aggressive treatment as they probably should. So in fact, I'm happy to leave that in the model because it'll then mean that those patients are predicted as being higher risk, and maybe that means they will get more aggressive treatment, and it'll tend to compensate for them having received less aggressive treatment. But I would want to tell doctors and patients about this effect and say you might want to start being more aggressive with older patients as opposed to giving them less care. So I might want to tell doctors and patients about this, but maybe I'm happy to leave it in the model. The thing that's happening at retirement age, what I'd love to do if I collect the data again, is get a retirement variable, because not everybody retires at this age. So now the retirement effect would get captured on what would be a new graph, a 57th graph. So that would be nice. And then what will happen is this graph will more genuinely reflect the intrinsic risk as a function of age, because it won't have to compensate for the retirement effect, which is highly correlated, of course, with age. So it'll be nice then to have that retirement effect on a separate graph, and now the risk as a function of age will get pure. So this is one of those rare situations where adding more terms to the model can actually make each of the terms more sensible, more intelligible, by sort of causing the risk to be properly distributed among the different variables. So that's great. Okay. These edits that we're going to make to the model, maybe fixing this stuff over 101. Should we always do that? Is it always the right edit to make? Depends on what we're going to do with the model. Suppose we're an insurance company and our interest in the model's predictions is purely actuarial. We just want to know whether we need to keep more funds in the bank for your healthcare next year because you actually are going to survive this year. Well, it turns out the model is already, I'm assuming that the insurance company is not going to intervene in your healthcare. So now we just want a model that's an accurate reflection of the statistics of the world as it currently operates. Well, now you don't need to edit the model. You can, in fact, you could use a black box and it would make predictions, and you maybe don't care about what's inside the black box as long as the predictions are accurate. There's an advantage, perhaps, to having a model like this if it's just as accurate. You can now see interesting phenomena like something you might not have expected, that patients over 100 actually seem to have a higher probability of surviving than patients who are in their 90s. But you could use a black box, or you could use this model unedited. That's very important. It turns out there's no such thing as the model is right or the model is wrong. There's no such thing as the data is right or wrong or has been properly cleaned. It all depends on exactly what you're going to do with the predictions from the model, what you need to do. And there are a number, I don't have time to show you all the details, there are a number of settings where we sit down with healthcare practitioners and we carefully discuss some detail in the model that looks questionable, that we're thinking of fixing. And what we have to do is we have to discuss exactly how we believe the prediction from the model will be used. If the prediction from the model will change, say, some care that the patients have received, and we're seeing that care show up on the graph, then maybe we want to remove that effect from the graph. But if the model's predictions aren't going to change the care the patient receives, then it's actually more appropriate to leave that effect in the graph. So it can be very complicated sometimes, deciding what we should and shouldn't fix, and then deciding how to fix it. And by the way, when we fix the model, we're overruling the statistics of the world, right? So you got to do this cautiously. And when we fix the model, the accuracy on the test set goes down, right? Because the test set looks just like the training set. Right? This problem we have with asthma is very real, and it's going to happen in all data that you're going to collect in Western civilization, right? Because all asthmatics are going to get to care faster and receive more aggressive and effective treatment. So they're all going to look lower risk. And you might think, oh, we could fix it by doing an RCT. Okay, you know, send half of the asthmatics home. Don't give them high-quality care. But of course, we're not going to do that. We're not going to kill some asthmatics to train a better model. So we have to live with the data as we get it. And that means effects like this, and I'll show you a few more, are always going to be in your data. Every data set you have where there's a relationship between the symptoms of asthma and the symptoms of the disease you're looking at, where those symptoms overlap, every one of those data sets will have this kind of effect in it. Okay? Let me show you a few more of these things. Well, first of all, anytime you see jumps at round numbers, this is almost always some sort of social human policy kind of effect. And we see jumps at round numbers all over in the models, all sorts of fascinating things. We see treatment effects, you know, where your risk is going up, 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 up until you hit 5, and then it suddenly drops. And then it goes up, 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 up until you hit 10, and then it drops again. And those are treatment effects because we use round numbers to decide whether to treat or not, right? You suddenly hit 5.1, we treat, the treatment is effective, your risk goes down. Right? So you wonder about the patients who are at 4.9. Their risk is actually quite high. Maybe we should have treated them as well. Maybe we need sort of continuous dosing or something like that. OK, so these jumps are fascinating. And they tell us that the model is very sensitive because we see little jumps all over the place. And they're often explainable. Of course, the model learned that asthma lowers risk. That's what we anticipated. It's a real pattern in the data. And the way we would fix that is we would let the model learn that. And then we would, for example, put a 0 in front of that coefficient to make that particular effect go away. Or if a doctor told us to, we could actually make the risk go from minus something to plus 10. We could make the risk go through the roof. If the doctor said, you know, I want every asthmatic to be admitted to the hospital, make the risk huge. We could do that. It wouldn't be statistically correct for sure, but it would serve a purpose. Here's the interesting things. The model also learned that a history of heart disease and a history of chest pain are good for you if you have pneumonia. In fact, the best thing, even better than asthma, the best thing is to have had a heart attack sometime within the last 5 years. Right? This is the best thing from a pneumonia point of view. And the explanation is very much like the asthma story. So you know, you've had a heart attack, you wake up this morning, your breathing's a little funny, your chest feels a little funny. Right? You don't even waste an hour getting to the ER. And when you get to the ER, you get to the front of the line. Right? You're on a bed very fast with probes attached to you. So you get incredibly rapid diagnosis. And good news, you're not having another heart attack. It's just pneumonia. But because you have pulmonary disease, you know, they consider you to be high risk, just as if you were an asthmatic. So you get, and you're already there in the hospital on the bed. So you get incredibly, you know, high quality, rapid care. There's nothing more rapid than sort of getting to the hospital at the first sign of symptoms. And they're not going to treat you for heart disease if they don't think you have heart disease. So they're going to really make an effort to figure out the right diagnosis. And then you're going to get very high quality care. So this is a magic thing. And in fact, the heart disease patients have half the chance of dying from pneumonia as the non-heart disease patients. So even though they're an older cohort of patients. So it's remarkable. So this is yet another case where a disease, in this case, a history of heart disease, is acting as a proxy for incredibly rapid time to care and then high quality treatment. Yeah. OK, So it's good we didn't deploy the neural net back in the 1990s, because I assume it had these things in it. Like, I can see it in this model, and this model is similar, a little better accuracy than the neural net. I assume the neural net had it. But this new model, we can sort of understand what it's doing, and we can fix these things. We can put zeros in front of them or other kinds of edits. So this model would be much safer to deploy than the neural net. It's not perfect. I don't want to make you think this solves all problems, but it's a huge step forward. Here's the surprising thing. You might think you could fix the asthma heart disease problem by removing features of other variables. Means that it'll get its heart disease, asthma over 100 effect. It'll get that as best it can through correlation with all the other variables. And now what will happen is this will sort of metastasize throughout the model. It'll spread through the model in a way that you can't localize and detect. You won't even know the problem is there. It'll be spread among dozens or hundreds of other variables. You won't even know the problem is there. And even if I told you the problem was there, you wouldn't know exactly how to fix it, because it just spread in some complex way throughout the organism. So it turns out, this is really a surprise. This is also true in race and gender socioeconomic bias. The most important thing is you leave the variables you're most afraid of in the model. You let the model do its worst to be as biased as possible, as biased as the data suggests. And then afterwards, you can see the bias, and then you have a chance of repairing the bias. And then you don't retweak the model, because if you retweak the model, it'll bleed back into the other variables. So it's an amazing and sort of surprising thing that you have to keep these variables in the model, let the model do its worst, and then sort of see what it's done, and then repair the model after the fact. So that's a sort of surprising conclusion that we've drawn from using these kinds of models. With a neural net, I wouldn't quite know what to do. It wouldn't be that simple of a story, because I wouldn't have a way of seeing the problems and then repairing the problems. Now, I've been telling you some horror stories, and I tell you these horror stories are true of all the data sets that we all work with. So we all have these problems, even if you don't have the glasses, that let you see the problems yet. But I want to tell you there's a lot of wonderful things. I mean, these machine learning models are learning beautiful things inside. 95% of what they learn is right on the money, is really, really very good. And in some cases, we can actually learn from the models. They can teach us things. I was showing doctors all of these graphs, and I was just quickly flashed by this graph. And the doctor said, oh, go back. No, yeah, that one. And I said, wow, it just looks like a boring graph that I see a lot of in healthcare, which is, a lot of something like high blood pressure, triglycerides, cholesterol. It's not good for you, and less of it is better for you. Right? And there's a lot of graphs in healthcare that look like this, right? BMI graph, whatever. They look like this. And the doctor said, what's interesting is we've learned not to treat, this is blood urea nitrogen, we've learned not to treat until a threshold of 50, another round number. And your graph is saying that risk is already very high by, say, 40. And the doctors looked at each other, and they're like, hey, I learned 50 in med school. Where'd you learn 50? Oh, I learned it in med school, too. So presumably, this is a sort of treatment protocol that was adopted many years ago, which is still in use. And the doctors look at the graph, and they said, maybe we should reconsider this. Now, I wouldn't suggest changing healthcare based on one graph on one data set. That would be risky, right? We wouldn't want to do that. But certainly it's suggesting that we maybe should study this issue more carefully and try to figure out if, in fact, the risk is high enough at 40 compared to the treatment, that, in fact, we should start treating earlier. So and we see a number of these sorts of things in graphs as well. So there are lots of beautiful things happening in the graphs. I mean, there are some things where I'll show a doctor the graph, and he says, this is beautiful. We all suspect that this is true, but this is the first time I've seen a model actually statistically show me that this is true. It's just so nice to actually see your model pick this up. So we see lots of wonderful things in these machine learning models. And I'm a machine learning researcher for healthcare, so I definitely believe that machine learning is a powerful tool we should be using in healthcare. I just want to make sure we use it as cautiously as possible. So let me talk briefly about pairwise interactions. So these are things where a function, this is the risk as a function of age. This is risk as a function of cancer. If you have cancer, it does increase your chances of dying from pneumonia by a significant amount. But there are some things that you can't model as a function of age plus a function of cancer independently. You have to reason about cancer and age together. So that would be a pairwise interaction. Let me just show you one of these. There are 10 of these in the model. The most important part is this yellow at the bottom here. This corresponds to patients who are very young, 18 to say 23 or 24. So and remember, patients who are very young are very low risk, right? It's good to be young. Well, this is an example of it not being good to be young. So if you have cancer and you're very young, the model wants to add 0.5 to your risk. That's a lot of additional risk, on top of the fact that you're already getting sort of 0.4 something added to your risk because you have cancer. So the model's adding a lot more to your risk for these young patients. It took a while to figure this out. We're pretty sure that the story is that most of these patients are patients who have had cancer as teens. So they've had cancers of children. They're not considered to be cured from their cancer, so the treatment hasn't been 100% effective yet, or they would be on this other side. Okay? So these are patients who have been treated very aggressively as we treat children with cancer. We treat them more aggressively than we treat adults. Their immune system has been knocked out by this very aggressive treatment. They're not considered to be cured yet from their cancer. And if they're in this study, if they're in this data set, they have pneumonia. So these are patients whose immune system has been knocked out by very aggressive treatment. They're not yet considered to be cured, and they now have pneumonia. So these are a particularly high-risk group of very young patients who the model has learned need to have this extra special high risk added to them, that despite the fact that they're so young, these patients are at unusually high risk. So the interactions are all interesting. A number of the interactions are with age. But this is one of the ones that's easy to tell the story. OK. There are lots of different ways to use this sort of model. We've been doing what I would call global use of the model, which is we train the model, we look at the model, we have experts help us look at the model. We try to find the beautiful things that the model has learned, and we try to find the mistakes that the model has learned, the things that we want to correct before using the model, because we have some idea how we're going to use these predictions. So we want to find the errors that we want to fix, and we want to learn from the model if it can tell us something interesting. There's another way to use this model, which is you can actually just make a prediction for an individual patient, and then we can explain that prediction. And I'll give you an example of this. We can basically sort the terms to see which terms add most to your risk or decrease your risk the most. And I'll give you an example of that. There's a third way of using it, which I won't be able to show you, which is you train some black box model. Maybe it's a deep neural net. And then what you do is you train one of these intelligible models to mimic the black box model. So this is a technique that I and Jeff Hinton and others have developed, where we can train a simple model to mimic a more complex model. And then if it's a reasonable fidelity student model, we can open up the student model and understand what's going on inside of it. And it'll tell us something about what's going on inside of the black box model. So that's a fun thing to do. But instead, I want to give you a demo of using this thing for explanations of individual patients. And then we're going to wrap up. Then we're done. OK, so this is a patient. This is now not pneumonia. This is a 30-day all-cause hospital readmission prediction. This is a collaboration with New York Presbyterian Hospital that we've had going for 6 or 7 years now. So this is just one of the patients. This is a patient who's in particularly high risk of readmission. Model predicts a 92% chance that this patient's going to need readmission. That's incredibly high. And what we've done is this model has 4,250 graphs in it. So we're never going to look at all the graphs, right? That's impossible. And what we've done is for this patient, we've sorted by how much each term adds to their risk. So we're just looking at the things that add the most to the risk. So the single thing that adds most to the risk is fat emulsion intravenous preparations, a value of 100. 100 falls here in the graph, so you can see it's the highest risk part of the graph. And that adds 0.45 to their risk. Okay? So we're putting calories into the patient through an IV. The patient apparently has cyclical vomiting syndrome. I don't know what the scale is for cyclical vomiting syndrome, but apparently they have a 16 on the scale. That falls here in the graph, which is in the high-risk area. They're receiving amitriptyline preparations. This is the dose that they're receiving. So they're at a high risk of readmission through the amitriptyline preparations. I believe that's an anti-nausea med, or at least that's one of the uses of this med. They've been an inpatient 64 times. Okay? So, of course, their chance of readmission is pretty high. They've been an inpatient in the last 12 months 18 times. So their mean time between readmission is less than 30 days. And then they've been an inpatient in the last 6 months 10 times, right? So they're an inpatient a lot. And there's a scale for vomiting that I assume some of you know about. And their value on this scale is 107, which again is sort of a high-risk part of the graph. OK, so now what have we done? We've looked at 6 or 7 graphs for this patient. Remember, there are 4,250 graphs in the model. We did not look. The vast majority of people do not have the vast majority of conditions. So in healthcare, there tend to be a small number of things that cause you to be high risk. So, and I think we feel like we have some understanding of why this patient is high risk, right? They have cyclical vomiting syndrome, apparently very severe. They've been receiving treatment ongoing. They've been in the hospital many more times than normal, and that's why they'll be in the hospital again. Let me now flip to another patient. This is a patient whose probability of readmission is just typical. About 8% chance of readmission in 30 days is normal at this hospital. This patient has been an inpatient 6 times. They have this electrolyte imbalance, which we often see. They have DX codes that indicate a sort of history, to their own health, hazards to their own health. This would be either suicide attempts or riding their motorcycle at 200 miles an hour, things like that. Oh, they've been in the ER 6 times. They've been in the hospital 6 times, been through the ER 6 times. So almost all their admissions, appear to have come through the ER. Oh, they have combat fatigue. I don't know what the scale is for this, but they have combat fatigue. Drug intoxication, 1, so it's not the high-risk part of the scale, but they have mild drug intoxication. And they've been an inpatient, once in the last 3 months. So this is just a normal patient. So now you can see this patient is incredibly different from the previous patient, right? It's not cyclical vomiting syndrome. This is a vet. The vet is having some problems with drugs, perhaps with suicide. So this patient has very different problems. And yet, by just looking at, again, a half a dozen graphs, we have a sense of what makes this patient different from the other patient. OK, so we can do that for hundreds of patients. And this is particularly valuable for trying to quickly understand why the model predicts any particular patient is very high risk or low risk. OK, so let me just wrap up. Accuracy on a test set, laboratory accuracy is never indicative of what's going to happen in the real world. I think many of you know that. So you should take all these reports that deep learning has superhuman accuracy. You should take all those things with a grain of salt. Because the test set looks like the training set in the lab. And remember, our model is being rewarded for the lowest risk patient in our pneumonia model are patients who have asthma, heart disease, chest pain, and they're over 100, right? Those are incredibly low-risk patients. And the model is being rewarded for predicting that they're low-risk patients. And yet we know that they're not low-risk patients. So you should take accuracy when measured in the lab with a grain of salt, because your model is being rewarded for all sorts of things that are completely inappropriate if the model were to be deployed. The data is always going to have these sort of landmines in it. It's always going to have surprising problems that you wouldn't have anticipated. You need some magic pair of glasses that helps you see what the model has learned, and it'll tell you more about the data than you ever thought possible. These kinds of models are giving us a surprisingly nice combination of accuracy and intelligibility. They're even editable. We have tools that are going to be available soon so that everybody can use these models. You might think you could solve some of these problems by removing the features. You can't do that. You actually should leave them in. Let the model be as bad as it can be, and then fix it. And the fundamental problem that we're trying to fix here is that machine learning does not work the way humans work so far. And because of that, it's going to make very different kinds of mistakes than we make. And those mistakes are things that would be very detrimental in healthcare. OK, so you've got your choice sometimes between a black box and some book that you can read if you put the effort into it. When possible, you should, of course, use the intelligible model. And thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rich, for orienting us to real problems with real insights on interpretability and intelligibility of these models. We have a few minutes for questions.
And I'll be around all day if anyone wants to talk.
We have a question up in the front here.
Thank you for that presentation. In the example that you gave, that was a true positive, right, of patients. That's a patient that predicted a high probability and actually was readmitted.
For the readmission, yes.
Right.
Yes.
So can you comment a little bit about the false positives, right, and your exploration of that and what that looked like? So how often do you get a patient that looks really similar to that patient but didn't? Or maybe you didn't see that in the data.
Right. If the patient looked very similar to that patient, then it would have a similar predicted probability. And it might, I mean, there's a good chance that patient, I mean, a patient who has a 92% chance of being readmitted still has an 8% chance of not being readmitted in 30 days.
Right.
So we expect roughly 10% of the patients who we predict 90% for will not be readmitted. So there are many patients, and I almost hesitate to use the term false positive and false negative for readmission, since I mean, it's very different from say, diagnosis, where we're saying the patient does have this disease or does not, and then we're actually right or wrong. But the model is well calibrated probabilistically. So the probabilities are sort of indicative of the rates that we would expect. I guess what you might be asking about, are there special classes of patient where the model actually is just completely wrong? Its probabilities are way off. And of course, the model is not perfect. It does not do all things well. It surprises us in some cases. There is something like risk of readmission as a function of number of admissions goes up as your number of admissions goes up, as you'd anticipate. And then surprisingly, it levels off and starts to drop. And we thought, wow, that doesn't make any sense. And you might think, oh, well, maybe those patients are actually dying because they're so sick. It turns out it's dialysis. So the dialysis patients are technically being counted as admissions to the hospital. But they're receiving the highest quality health care any patient could receive. They're seeing medical professionals multiple times a week. So we do see interesting effects like that where you look at it and it doesn't feel like it even makes sense until you do the detective work. And you realize, oh, it does kind of make sense. But now realize for dialysis patients who maybe would be in the hospital 100 times, roughly over a year, there are going to be other patients who might be in the hospital, well, 50 times or 100 times. And the model can't distinguish on just the number of admissions graph whether they're dialysis or not. That would have to be a pairwise interaction. So it is going to say, well, there are other patients who are in the hospital a lot, and their risk is also going down, even though they're not dialysis patients. So the model will not be correct unless it then picks up a pairwise interaction that corrects for this effect. So it is definitely not a model that's sort of perfect or correct all the time. And we can see cases like this dialysis number of admissions effect, where there are some other patients who are not dialysis patients who are very, very sick. And the model is actually predicting a little lower risk for them when it shouldn't. Yeah.
Any other questions? Phidias.
Very nice talk. I really enjoyed it. I think what you highlighted nicely is that I'm a physician. I think we're talking about enabling AI in healthcare. I think one of the barriers has been getting physicians to buy in on something that they think will potentially replace them. But I think you showed nicely that at least for this era that we live in, where there's a lot of change, there's a lot of social change. We saw, cannabis being legalized. There's a lot of new technologies and therapies that are being developed. Chances are, my feeling is for the next kind of generation, there's going to be so many new variables that is not in the training data that physicians are actually going to be even more valuable to try to understand these kind of changes, like the retirement age, right? That you need right. Real intelligence to make those corrections that are still not in the training set. So I think that's a really important thing you highlighted.
So I completely agree. So it turns out one of the things machine learning models don't do at all is handle change unless you give them a new updated training set. So they can't handle change at all. There are cases where a model is trained on CT scans, and it's really very good. It looks as good or maybe better than radiologists at interpreting these CT scans. And then they improve the CT machine. They go to a new model, which actually has higher resolution and lower noise. And all of a sudden, the model is far worse. They didn't update the model. The model was trained on the previous generation of machines, and suddenly the accuracy goes way down in a way that a human radiologist presumably would look at the new CT scans and say, these are great, I can see so much more. and presumably their accuracy would, if anything, maybe be helped. Now, humans also have to make these, transitions with change. But humans understand that the change has happened. The models do not know that change has happened. They just are happy to go ahead and keep making the same mistakes over and over again until we somehow help them. One of the things the models don't do is they don't have a model of what they're good at and bad at. And they don't have a model of the fact that suddenly they're much worse than they used to be, and that maybe something has changed in the world, and they don't know to adapt to it. Yeah, I completely agree.
So this is fantastic. I got a lot of questions in the audience. We're going to have to wrap it up so we stay on schedule.
It's my fault.
Rich is going to hang for the day, I hope.
Yeah.
Right? And we have an event at JLabs this evening, late afternoon, for a chance to interact and ask more questions. So we're going to go on. Thanks, Rich. Fantastic.
Thanks.